It's my pleasure to introduce Doug Blake, our speaker this evening. And I've known Doug as a family friend for years. But if he looks familiar to you and you don't know why, because you don't know him, but I may have an explanation for that. Doug's face for years has been plastered on billboards and buses and brochures all over Massachusetts, advertising what was then known as Plymouth Plantation. And that is because, in addition to being photogenic, for a decade, Doug lived in this alternate universe where he spent his days in a 1660s time warp playing the role of Miles Standish, and I'm now told actually others, Governor Bradford, and
like anyone that you can think of.
With these highly nuanced and accurate roles. He had a whole faux pilgrim family.
Multiple. Don't tell the other. Or my real wedding.
But anyway, I'm happy to say that Doug has now is back in our millennia and currently working for the Mayflower Society, where he remains steeped in pilgrim history. And all this to say that if you want the inside scoop and the really good gossip about what was really going down in the Plymouth colony, this guy is the one you want to talk to. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I suppose it is my duty to let everybody know that despite me working for the Mayflower Society, I am not representing the Mayflower Society on this evening, unless you really like it, in which case, of course, like, go talk down. But I do know a lot about pilgrims, more than most people ever want to, probably, and I've read Bradford more times than I would like to admit, and these are some of my numerous primary sources. So these are all written, for the most part, by the pilgrims or people that knew the pilgrims, so they're very interesting to read. That old early modern dialect, that old early modern grammar, really long run-on sentences, which after you listen to me for a little bit, you'll realize I kind of talk like that now, and pretending to be these people did not help in any way. But what I want to kind of talk to you today about, I know I'm really pleased that you all decided to come for a riveting economics talk. So it is nominally about economics, of course, because I think it's very important. When I say economics, it's more just a basic understanding of how and why these people that we know, pilgrims, came to Cape Cod and Plymouth. Because it's kind of hard to get from the books when you read it, because not only is it a very complicated subject, it's a complicated subject written in a complicated way. So hopefully I can kind of translate it for you. So I'll talk for a little while, and if you have any questions at the end, you can ask. And of course, if you have questions that are like really pressing on you, more of like, what did you just say? I don't understand it, either because of the way I talk, or, I mean, some of these words might be weird, or just concepts. You know, if you think it would be very useful, you can ask during, because I'd rather people not be sitting there the whole time thinking about, like, what is this question I'm going to ask? You know, if I say, you know, when you stop, you don't know what it is, by all means, you know, if it will help everyone, please ask. I also can ramble, but I won't, I promise. So we'll try to stay on task so we can get home, you know, a reasonable hour. So the first thing I think that's important, and I will be checking this every once in a while to make sure we do that, is not because I don't like you guys, it's, I don't have a more important thing to do. Although actually, much like the movies, silence yourself. There we go. Before we begin, we have to kind of know what a pilgrim is. This is kind of a modern catch-all term that we have applied to these people in the 17th century that honestly, they didn't really use for themselves the way that we think they do. So William Bradford wrote in his book, in one passage, in one paragraph, they knew they were pilgrims when he's talking about the fact that they're going on this journey with their church. But that's not what they called themselves. Sometimes they refer to themselves as saints, but they don't mean it in that sort of biblical sense that we're kind of thinking right now, because these people were very much kind of against that, like the idea that, well, it's just the idea that they were followers of Christ. So anyone that was a saint in the church, that's sort of a general term for almost like Christian. But what we also, I might go over some very basic stuff that maybe you already know, but I'm just going to start at the baseline, just in case, because I don't want to insult anyone, but I don't know this. Has anyone heard of the term saint and strangers, right? This is from a book that came out a while ago. This is a very catchy title. But oftentimes now, when we're talking about the Pilgrims, and they get sort of, it gets stuck in your head that there's these two very distinct people that were totally different. And what we're going to find out as we're talking is that they actually were a lot more intertwined than we think. So, like I said that Bradford only really mentions the saints the one time, the Pilgrims one time, he really only calls them strangers once, and he means it quite literally what the word means. He didn't know who these people were, because they met him for the first time on the Mayflower, so they were quite literally strangers. So really, they're not like their own little group, it's just, and these people that I don't know. So what were these two groups? One is what we think of as the Pilgrims, the Bradford, the Brewster, the Winslow. These guys were part of a separated church. So they felt that the church in England wasn't following Christ the way it should. And so their solution was to take their congregation and flee the country. But unlike what I thought when I first was growing up as a little kid, I was like, oh yeah, they came to America, but they didn't. They went to the Netherlands, specifically to Amsterdam at first. Now they didn't do it right away because it was also illegal to leave. So they were essentially criminals. They were being kind of harried and, harassed for their beliefs. They eventually, after Bradford said many, trials and tribulations, some of them were jailed, children and women, and they eventually let them go because no one really wants to jail women and children. They eventually all got to Amsterdam. And so they're living in Amsterdam, and they're not the only church. So that's the other thing. When you say, we think of separatists, we think of like this big movement, so they must all know each other. Like it's a Republican and a Democrat, or like any sort of big grouping of people. But in reality, it's just something that we also call them. They didn't call themselves separatists. They called themselves Christians because they thought they were right and that they were wrong. The other people thought that they were right and that those people were wrong. So there were a lot of separated churches, each one kind of doing its own thing, but at the same time, many of them kind of believing similar things so that these separated churches kind of would get along. So while they're living in Amsterdam, they have, some other English people are living there because Amsterdam is kind of even nowadays, still like a very free-loving place. So they were able to get away with what they were doing. But the problem is, and this is another thing we're going to kind of learn about, is that we always hear that the Pilgrims came to America for freedom of religion, which is true, but not the way that we think about it. It's freedom to practice their religion. So they didn't actually like the idea of everyone doing whatever they wanted. Now they felt, this is where it gets kind of complicated. So they said, yeah, you do whatever you want, but it's, you do what you want, but not in our town. So they were like kind of, not really like these free-loving spirit people that we think. They just thought that they should be able to worship the way they wanted without harassment. So they left. The problem is when they were in Holland, the Dutch were like, yeah, do whatever you want, but they were like, everybody do what they want. And so they were actually not very happy with that. The additional problem was, just like, everywhere at all times, they were immigrants and they just couldn't get good work because the good jobs went to the Dutch because it's the Netherlands. So they were actually having trouble supporting themselves. So eventually they decided, we're going to leave Amsterdam, and we're going to go to smaller cities. They went to Leiden, which is a smaller city in the Netherlands, and the province of Holland. And so they were granted permission to leave, so they went with their very specific small church. And a couple of their people that were with them actually stayed in Amsterdam, either because they were going with a different minister, or they were just too old to move at that point. So you might have heard the name John Robinson. That's the Pilgrims' pastor. That was their guy. It was essentially a church of like his. He's probably mad somewhere if I said that, but like he was the church guy for them. So after he passes away later, not to like give away the story, but their church kind of dies out. So the closest thing that we might have now is congregationalism, and that idea of like the small congregation, but like these very specific kind of church, and people will often ask, well, what is it now? It is gone. That's basically what it was. It was hard to be in their church. They were very studious, they were very dedicated, and so if you wanted to be in, they used the old Psalter, they used the old Bible, they were like, King James Bible mentions pants, it's garbage. We're going with the Geneva Bible, which, you gotta kind of translate. And so they were really, really about the Bible, really about following the letter of the law of God, according to them. And so they are what we think of as like the pilgrims. These are the saints in these two groups. Now, this other group of people we don't know nearly as much about. Some of them are big names, you know all of them. Probably. I say this like I've been studying this forever, so I'm sometimes like, what? I've never heard Bradford. What are you talking about? Miles Standish, we mentioned. Hopkins. These people, because they were part of this church that like kind of ran away from England, like people have been doing studies on where are these people from, but it's not always easy to find. So that's why they were strangers. These people met up with this church via an intermediary. So now we're going to kind of get into the economics part. But one last point about the whole separatists, non-separatists, saints, strangers, this and that. Often nowadays, we like to just kind of put people in groups. Not just people, everything. Like human nature is to organize stuff. One of our natures. And so, it's not as clear-cut as that. There were people that were separatists that were far more loose in their, yeah, I love your church, but, I might get a job with the king later and not come back. And there were people that were with the so-called strangers that were probably, everyone was very religious back then, even if they weren't part of this church. Like our concept of, oh, those guys weren't the religious ones, were still super religious, partly because you had to be. Like you would go to jail if you didn't go to church, which is part of the reason these people were getting arrested, is because they weren't going to church, they were doing it themselves, which was illegal. So it's not to say that, like, often we think, myself included, when I was growing up, you either were there for religion or you're there for money. And the truth is they were all there for money, in a way. Not actually money, we'll get to that in a moment. But they're all there for worldly reasons, and some of them were also there for their spiritual reasons. Essentially, the good way to put it is everyone was there to have a better life for themselves, and especially to provide a better life to their children, which is a very relatable thing, I think. That's the big sort of theme of this, is that, as in all history, but, we're talking about pilgrims today, so that's the topic, these were people. They had good thoughts, bad thoughts, they did good things, bad things. They're not heroes, but they're not villains, they're just people. Just like you and me, they had thoughts, desires, dreams, fears. And so, just like we would think, if anyone has children, or knows someone has children, or needs you want the next generation to be better off, I would hope. And so these people were the same way. So the ones that were living in Holland were like, well, we can't go back to England, but if I stay here, my kids are going to be poor, and they might turn Dutch, and they might become, something else. The people in England, it wasn't that great in England either for some of these people. These are all middle-class people. You might be losing your job, you might be getting kicked out due to the impounding laws that were happening, or a lot in the country. They're sort of taking land that was always common, and now they're kind of like, well, actually, this belongs to the landlord, and I don't care if your sheep used to be there, you're going to go somewhere else. So it was hard to get work in England, too. So it's probably no coincidence that a lot of these people, we believe, were around the London area, which, is one of the biggest populations in England. So these are people looking for work, a lot of young men, which is also conveniently what you need to start a new town in the middle of nowhere. So that's the people we're talking about. But let's talk about like what they were doing. So essentially, if you think about pilgrims, you're probably thinking like, okay, these people gave them a bunch of money, and then they had to pay them back, and that was like the whole deal. And it's not entirely that. It's a little bit more complicated, but as you hopefully will see, it's actually very similar to how things are run now. So, in a nutshell, the town of Plymouth, was a joint stock company, just like you would think of like a shareholder type company nowadays. A little different, obviously, but the concept, it seems like it shouldn't be that long ago, but this is kind of where it started, like companies, and the idea that you could buy into it and get shares, and then you will get more than you put in, hopefully, when you're done. And that's how these people got here. So the idea was the people that were living in Leiden, the Leiden congregation, they knew they wanted to leave. They thought, we should go to America, so how are we going to do it? And they needed money. So they were looking around, and they started shopping maybe with the Dutch. They were trying to get permission from the king. This is another thing to think about, is that you can't just go to America, because of course every country back then was like, oh yeah, we own that. So it's like, oh, it's not New England, it's New Netherlands, it's New France, it's, you know, Cataumet, which it actually was. But it's one of those things where, you know, there's people living here, there's people that want to live here, but according to all the people back in Europe, it's like theirs. So the king realized, well, I might not like these people, because they're not following my rules, but they are English. So if I let them go over to America, it's a lot harder for the French to say that this is New France if there's some English people living there. Worst case scenario, they all die. What's up? Best case scenario, they prosper, there's no French people there, there's no Dutch people there, and then I'll eventually start taxing them. It's like a win-win for him. So he eventually lets them go with like the promise that they're going to listen and like obey the church laws, kind of, which there's always like this tenuous thing going on, which you'll see in all these business deals. It's kind of like, don't rock the boat too much, because if you rock the boat too much, it's fine and dandy that they elected, you know, John Carver and then William Bradford, but they're not gentlemen. So if the king decides, guess what, Lord so-and-so is coming over, like, they're done. And he's not going to let them keep their weird church to them, you know, like, so they're kind of playing it along the fence as best they can, which you'll see is really the reason a lot of this like turmoil happens, because they can't just outright do what they want, but they also can't let what they do is like bad happen. So it's kind of this balancing act. And so they're talking to the Dutch. They eventually get permission from the King of England, James at the time, sort of. And so they didn't get a charter. They just got like permission. So the way it worked, getting into the nitty-gritty, is the king doesn't really want to deal with like everything. So he's like, all right, Virginia, which goes from like Florida, which is Spanish and French, all the way up to Nova Scotia, like it's all of it. You're going to have a council of Virginia. These are people that I appoint, so I don't like to think about it too much, and you guys deal with it, make sure I'm happy, and you guys can hand out patents and charters, basically deeds, and you guys run it and figure it out. And eventually they split it, so then it becomes New England and Virginia, which is important because when I'm going to read in a moment the original agreement they had, you'll notice it keeps saying Virginia, which they didn't end up in. Sometimes this is known as sort of like Northern Virginia. This is where they're shooting for. Northern Virginia is like Manhattan nowadays, which is where they were trying to go, because it was far enough away from like Jamestown and, you know, Roanoke and all those already established places that they would hope that they wouldn't really be harassed, but they could still be English. Because remember, even though, like a lot of times we think, you know, they came here because they wanted to make America and they wanted to, you know, they hated the king and all. No, they loved the king, they just thought he was foolish. Like, well, he's not doing it right, but he is the king. And according to them, God makes kings, and I'm not going to argue with God. So I don't agree with the way he's doing it, but I'm not going to say he shouldn't be king. I just leave. And so they wanted to be English. They wanted to be, that's why they left Holland. They wanted to be English. They wanted to, you know, respect the king. You listen to the Mayflower Compact, the first thing it says is, you know, in the name of God, and the Lord, King, just all his titles. So, you know, they're not trying to hide, because you can't really do that, they'll find you. So they make this patent, and what they do with a man named Weston, Thomas Weston, who was like the first villain in this. I said there weren't no villains, but I was a villain, I guess. I mean, he wasn't a villain, but he's the type of person that, you know, you might recognize nowadays, that he was maybe like legally selling things in Holland, possibly, we're not exactly sure, but you know, he's just kind of he's like, I know some people. And that's when you get the third group. So there's the strangers, who really are just English people living in England that want to come across. There's the saints, or just also English people that are living in exile. And then you get what's called the adventurers. So the adventurers aren't like they're new, they're actually the opposite. They're not going, for the most part. They're adventuring their money. We might call them investors nowadays. So they're just, oh, this is a good idea. These are people that have a little bit too much money, and they're like, well, I want to make more money with my money. I know, let's make something in the New World. And so that's how you get Jamestown. That's how you get all of these colonies originally. They're businesses. So these people are like, yeah. So there's like 100 of them. We don't know exactly how much they gave, because again, some of these records are sparse. We're only getting most of our information from one guy who's writing the book when he's like 60-something, remembering. So some of the math doesn't even add up. But they come to terms with this new agreement. So I'm just going to kind of go through it and kind of explain it. And this will kind of hopefully show what was going on. And then I'll tell you if it worked. It sort of didn't. But, let's see. Take some glasses off.
So they were venture capitalists.
Yeah. And some were just venturing their time and effort. So the idea is, basically everyone's giving something, and hopefully everyone is going to get something in return. Whether that works out or not, that's the adventure part. So this was the original agreement that they signed in July 1st, 1620. And actually they didn't even sign it, which is a big problem. Because they got into a tiff. About some of these, which I'll tell you in a second. So the first was the adventurers and planters, so we just went over what that is. So think of the planters as the saints and strangers. They are literally planting themselves in a new place and growing things. So that's planters, adventurers. These are the two groups. You can be both. Some of them were. You could go and also pay. They agreed that every person that goeth, being the age of 16 years and upward, be rated at £10, and £10 to be accounted a single share. So I'm going to give you a little context, because £10 is like, what? I don't know. That might be like a year's worth of wages, half a year to a year, depending. Some of the sources I've read, it seems you make maybe like 5 to 20 pounds a year as like a middle-class laborer in London. These are all like middle-class people. They're not the poorest of the poor for the most part, but they're certainly not rich enough that. And if they were of a little bit more means, like some of them might have been, they probably gave most of their money to get to Holland and then lost it there because it didn't have to work. So that's like a big investment. He that goeth in person and furnish himself out with £10 either in money or other provisions be counted as having 20 in stock, and the division shall receive a double share. So basically what they're saying is that if you go and also you pay, because you know, if you just go, you don't have to actually pay, because that's what the investors are doing. You just have to, as you'll see in a minute, work off what you owe. The persons transported and the adventurers shall continue their joint stock in partnership together the space of 7 years, except some unexpected impediment do cause the whole company to agree otherwise. Spoiler alert, they do. During which time all profits and benefits that are gotten by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, and any other means, any person or persons shall remain in the common stock until the division. So this is kind of like the meat of what this whole thing is. Essentially, you pay money, you come work, doesn't matter. For 7 years, starting from when they agree, everything is in common. This is how a lot of times people are like, oh, they're communists. That didn't exist yet. Wasn't a thing. They're also not capitalists because that also didn't exist yet. They're just, so you keep it in common because you are the company. So a lot of times people are like, oh, they work for the company. They do, but they are the company. So they have a share in it. So they're not really paying other people back. They're paying back essentially themselves, because either you share the wealth or you share the debt. Either way, you're sharing. So for 7 years, you're not allowed to do like free trade. You're not allowed to go wheeling and dealing. It's like everything's going to go through the company because it's orderly, and that's how companies work. You just do what you're told. And that wouldn't have been that weird to them because, again, they didn't have like free trade. That wasn't also the thing that they did in England. Everything was controlled. There wasn't a minimum wage. There was a maximum wage. Everything was controlled by the government. It was just the way it was done. So this isn't that weird of an agreement. And this is exactly the same as what happened down in Virginia, contract-wise, almost like it's like boilerplate. At their coming there, they choose out such a number of fit persons as may furnish their ships and boats for fishing upon the sea, employing the rest in their several faculties upon land, as building houses, tilling, planting the ground, and making such commodities as shall be most useful for the colony. So this is how they're going to make money. Because you think, why are they sending all these people here? Like, if you were an investor, you've got to expect a return. So the return was fish. This is what they thought. It's not a bad idea, because some people think, why would you go all the way across the ocean to get fish? Well, people have been fishing around England forever. There weren't as many fish. You come here, they might have been exaggerating a little bit, but they say you could walk across, you know, the Great Banks on the back of all the codfish. That's why it's called Cape Cod. Like, there was good fishing here. So the idea was, people were already coming here to get the fish for England and the rest of the continent. They were already fishing these. That's why, you know, Swanto, the Native Americans, you know, they'd already seen English people, because fishermen had been coming for like a while. And so the idea was you get a head start. So you're already here. So you're going out to where the fish are while they're getting ready to come over. When they're here, you're already fishing. And then you're like one step ahead. The idea being whoever gets back to England first with their fish gets the best price. So it was a good idea. Didn't work, but it was a good idea. So that's why they were coming here. And that's why they're saying, you know, if you're not a fisherman, you're going to do whatever it is that helps make us survive, which they did. Enough of it, obviously, we're talking about them. At the end of 7 years, the capitals and profits, vis-a-vis the houses, lands, goods, and chattels, be divided betwixt the adventurers and planters, which done every man shall be free from the other of debt, detriment concerning this adventure. So that's when you split everything up. This was one of the, whoever comes to the colony hereafter put any into the stock shall at the end of 7 years be allowed proportional to the time of his doing so. So that clause is essentially if you come in like halfway through, you don't get a fair share, you get half. Fair is fair. One of their problems was with the Article 5, where you notice it said houses. And they thought, well, I want to have my own house, like right from the get-go. And we want land right. So they were upset that they had to share everything right away. These are the lagging people. So that was one of their sticking points. You'll notice that point 7, he that shall carry his wife and children or servants shall be allowed every person now aged, and it goes on. So essentially they weren't talking about women and children at that point, because it's the 17th century, so they're like, oh yeah, this is just men. But oh yeah, if you bring your wife, she's worth something too, and kids are worth whatever, depending on how old they are. So either half a share or any children that are under the age of 10 that have no other share in division, but they'll get 50 acres of unmanured land. No, it's fair. That such persons as die before the 7 years, they're executors, to have their part or share division proportionally to their time. So if you die, whoever it is that gets your stuff will get a proportion of however long you worked. And then number 10, which is another thing they kind of had an issue with, is that basically everything comes through the company. So all your food, your meat, which back in the day just meant food, drink, apparel, provisions, all come out of the common stock. Again, why sometimes people would say, like, oh, it's communism, and then when they got rid of it, it worked. Again, they didn't have communism back then. It's just a company. It's like extreme capitalism in a way, but they also didn't have capitalism. So the idea is it's a business. So even these people that are religious, they're like, we're coming here to get land. Because land's the best thing you can get. None of these people really had land back in England. A few of them might have, but they sold it or gave it away to move to the Netherlands. So they're all coming here for that whole, you know, you can leave land to your kids. Like 100 acres per share was originally what they were promised. Now I'm going to tell you what happened. So obviously, and I'm going to kind of, you know, go a little quick, but then we have kind of questions after if I miss something. Obviously, Plymouth is still Plymouth, and we're standing here. So obviously it didn't totally fail. But business-wise, it was an abysmal failure for everyone involved. So they get here. We all know this part of the story. They can't get around Cape Cod. They can't get to Hudson's Bay, which is, like I said, basically Manhattan. So they're like, you guys get, because the other thing, Mayflower was just hired. It wasn't their ship. That's why I went home later. It stayed far longer than they intended. It's like hiring a U-Haul. And you just throw people in the back too, and having worked on Mayflower too, I can tell you that's kind of what it feels like. It was not pleasant, but no one really traveled back then. There were no like charter buses, because who's going to go to the middle of nowhere? Only desperate people. So the captain, or master of the ship, Christopher Jones, was like, you guys gotta leave, I wanna go home, like we're supposed to be home by Christmas. And they were delayed because they had another ship, the Speedwell, that was not very good. We don't know if the captain cheated them. William Bradford seems to insinuate in his book, without going so far as to possibly be, called for libel and slander, that the ship was fine once they got rid of it on the second try. So it was overmassive, which just meant it leaked too much. So it could have been done. He said he overheard some sailors talking. It's highly possible that basically that one was supposed to stay in the country to help them fish. Of course, then they left it, crammed onto the Mayflower, so now they're all stuck. Some of them stayed behind, didn't come until much later, or never made it. So they get here, they have to search Cape Cod, it's freezing cold, they've already been on the ocean almost double what they should have been. It took, 66 days to get across the ocean, which is about average, but that's the actual crossing. So they tried twice, so it's like a month and a half of just going back and forth, but you're still getting sick and weary, and being on a ship is not great. So they're getting ill, they're traipsing around Cape Cod, in the winter. They got, you've seen the clothes, they're wearing like socks, and they're wet, they say their feet are wet. So as people start dying on Cape Cod, they get to Plymouth eventually, decide, okay, this is where we're going to stay. Half of them die. So any plan that you had, like, all right, we got this plan, we're going to bring these people, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that, kind of gets thrown out the window when half of the people you brought die. So, oh, this guy died, I guess we can't build houses. Luckily, the carpenter lived, or the one that we know is a carpenter. But a bunch of other people passed away. So now they're not able to grow as much. It's a real tough time. So when they send the Mayflower back in the spring, it goes back empty, which does not make the investors happy. And immediately, they're already complaining. Because a lot of these people probably maybe never invested in anything before. And they're like, what do you mean there's no money right away? And they start getting cold feet, they're worried. To make matters worse, they're not living where they're supposed to. So all these contracts that I just read you, it's void. So that's why they made that compact that we all hear, the Mayflower Compact, what they call the combination, which is both a wonderful and rather mundane document. So it is important, it's very important to Plymouth, because it was basically, let's agree to what we already agreed to, because otherwise we're all going to die. But it also wasn't some grand crazy idea, because they were already going to do it. It was already like, you got to take care of yourselves. So basically they're just reconfirming it was a stopgap, which legally was made void the next year when they got a new patent for New England. But they kept it, so it was very important because they read it at every court. And William Bradford said that it made a covenant that maybe was stronger than any contract that they signed, because it was made by them. But it wasn't like the invention of democracy. So that's kind of it's another one of those, it's not the extremes, it's the middle. It was very important, but it wasn't so revolutionary that after that point, oh, I never thought, the Greeks were doing that. So they had those types of things in England. It just, the people that were doing it were slightly not the sort that would normally be doing it. These are, again, middle-class people. That's what gentlemen do. Gentlemen being an actual title. It's not just a politeness that we say now. That's a landed person. And they found that weird too. So that's part of the reason they had to make that document. And if you read some of the letters that Robinson wrote to them before they left, he's like, I know this is going to be weird. You got to elect people. There's no one there that's a gentleman. Because they fully believed, remember I was telling you about the king, they believed that everyone was put in their place by God. So if you were born a gentleman, you were there for a reason, because you're supposed to learn how to lead and do all this stuff. If you were born a worker, that's okay. You're just supposed to work. Everything has a place. Everything is meant to be the way it is. The great chain of command, the great, from the heavens down to rocks. Everyone has a place, which is a nice thought, but it does go against this idea that sometimes we have, these free-willing, we love freedom. They like structure. It made them uncomfortable to be unstructured. So they had to make up some agreements. So they did that. They're building it. They send it back empty. And that guy, Thomas Weston, immediately starts doing shady stuff. They send a different guy to get a new patent, who then Bradford says cheats them. He did, maybe he didn't. So they send the next ship, the Fortune, which comes back, brings a lot of people, not any supplies, because they ate them all on the way over, partly because it took double the time to get across the ocean. They almost left because they couldn't find them because they thought they were on Cape Cod, but they were over here. When they send the fortune back, they send it back with all sorts of goods, which is great. And then inside of England, French pirates take it, steal everything. They give the ship back after they're sued, but oh, nothing was in it. So again, more losses for this company. At this point, people are starting to bail in the adventurers back home already. So we have to have another meeting where they're like, guys, we just need to, let's pony up a little bit more money. Trust me, it'll be fine. And if you remember the agreement, it's only like 2 years in. So really they should have had that confidence to keep going, but people were getting nervous. There's a lot of money at stake. Thomas Weston is in all sorts of problems. He gets kicked out of the company, but doesn't tell the people in Plymouth. And so there's like people coming across with Thomas Weston. The people here are feeding them and taking care of them, and he's like, oh, I should have brought you stuff. I brought you this stuff. And they get a letter in the boot heel, like spy stuff, like hidden in the shoe, that says, don't trust Weston, we kicked them out. And then there's another letter that was from a wife of one of the people that lived here, but it was really from another guy in the company that's like, don't give Thomas Weston any people. This guy is shady, we kicked him out, he's not the treasurer anymore. This company goes to 3 treasurers in 3 years, which is never a good sign if you're a company. And so they're not making money, but they're also not getting supplies. They quickly figure out that what they need to do to make money is trade with the natives to get fur, beaver pelts especially, because those are worth a lot of money in England, because there's, the 30-year war is getting hot again. And where you used to get a lot of the furs over in Eastern Europe, Muscovia Trading Company, can't get it there, so you get it from America, even though it's the Atlantic Ocean, and people are paying top pound, I guess, for these fancy hats. So we need trade stuff. But the people back home, again, another really relatable but frustrating, you're fishermen, let's send you fish hooks in the wrong size. They don't even send a salter, because that's how you preserve the food. So they're buying salt and then send it back, even though there's like a huge ocean. So they don't send the person to make salt until 1623, who then, according to Bradford, talked really well, but wasn't a very good salt maker. He was very proud. He wouldn't let anyone see what he was doing, which is not a good sign. And then eventually he burned down the building by accident that they built for him to make salt. So he wasn't popular, never made salt. They had a carpenter finally come, like a ship carpenter, because you need boats to catch fish. And he was great, they said. He did all this hard work, and he dies in the summer, like right away in the heat. So they just really have no luck. They finally get a fishing ship. This is in 1624. This is like the last hurrah of the company, because in 1625, the company decides to dissolve. But they buy a ship, a little ship. It's called the Little James. Comes across. Along the way, they almost mutiny because the people that were hired for the contract thought that they were going to be privateers, which wasn't what they were going to do. They didn't want to work for wages. They wanted to work for shares. They get here finally. He has to rework out a deal with them, which they finally do. Goes up to Maine. That's where the fishing stages are. It's not properly secured. During a storm, it hits its own mooring, sinks. Then, the people in Plymouth are like, well, we can raise this up. So they paid to have everyone raise it up. There's actually a marvel of engineering, these barrels to lift it up, because it wasn't super far out. They repair it, they get it all good, they send it back. It gets seized for debts, because at this point, half the company is suing the other half, these investors. So they finally clear that. They bring it back. It's doing okay. It's filled with goods. It's on its way back to England, and it's taken by pirates. Not the French kind, so they never get it back. They sink it. It's Turkish pirates. Everyone's sold into slavery, and Standish was on the other ship that was with them. So, luckily, I guess, for the people in Plymouth and probably the Turkish pirates, he wasn't on that ship. So, you can see they just had terrible luck with fishing. The problem for Plymouth that was eventually rectified is that they can't, per the agreement, just go off on their own. So they're kind of stuck to these people. So by the end, they don't want to be involved necessarily. They wish they could just buy their own stuff and start trading. but they legally aren't supposed to, and the people back in England want to get rid of them. So eventually what happens, this is sort of the end of this part, and then I'll let you guys ask questions, or, or whatever. They come up with a new agreement to buy out their own company, essentially. So the adventurers back in England, this is in 1626. I mean, it takes a couple of years, because also the other hard part is like, all these business dealings, you gotta go all the way to England, and then you come back and you're like, oh, change this, go all the way to England, come back, It's not quick. They agree to sell everything to the people living here that are willing to buy it, which is all the men in the town, they have a meeting about it, for £1,800. This is what they work out. Which remember, £10 is like a year's wage, so this is a ton of money. But they really have no other alternative, because if they sell it to somebody else, people are like, yeah, you guys aren't really great, get off my new land. So they agree to do that. And they have to make essentially a mortgage payment every year, £200 on Michaelmas, which is, the Pilgrims didn't celebrate that as a holiday, but they did celebrate it as the day you pay your taxes in England, because it was also a civic day. And if they didn't, every month that they weren't paying, they tacked interest on it. So it's literally just like a mortgage, and until they pay it off, they don't actually own their stuff. The crown, or really the government, could come and it's not really the government, it's that company, the Company of New England it's called. It's the people that are appointed to hand out land. They'll come and get you. And a lot of times people are asking, well, they're not going to it's all the way across the ocean. You can just tell them to, kick rocks. What are you going to do? They're going to come get you because that's a lot of money. And the reason they're going to do it is not even really the money, it's the principle. Because you were supposed to go through these people to move to America. So if they can make, there's these people living out in the middle of nowhere that just say no, I'm not paying you, no one's going to pay them. So they will make an example of who the first people is that default on their loan. And the people in Plymouth knew that, so they're like, okay. So they eventually pay it off, obviously, because the town, but it took them forever. And eventually some people did have to kind of get what if we give you Situate? Are you cool with that? It's not that big, but it is, hundreds and hundreds of acres of land to some random guy that gave them money back in the day. And then he was like, okay. And some of the people that joined on, because they had people back in England that joined with them in this new company. And to make it further complicated, you might have any of you ever heard of the Undertakers, but not like the professional wrestler? They just undertook the debt. So it's these principal men in Plymouth, there's 7 or 8 of them, and then some back in England. These guys say, hey, how about you let me pay off the whole town's debt, and we get to have a fur trade for 6 years. And the town's like, that's fair. So basically, these people put their names on the line, because they'll be the ones that come to trade. But the thought was, especially the Bradfords and the Roosters and the people that were undertakers that had all their friends still stuck, because this whole time, immediately the company said, yeah, we're not letting any more of those people over here. Because people were writing to them saying, these guys are troublemakers, whether it's true or not. Bradford says it's slander. Of course, he's in the church, so we don't know. But I tend to think it wasn't their fault, it was just bad luck. But they were saying, oh, they're not working, they don't do stuff right. They had some legit complaints. They had some that weren't, like mosquitoes, wolves, drinking water, but they figured we can use that money to get people, our church across, which they did in 1629. On a ship called Mayflower, which made everything way confusing because it's not the same Mayflower. So if you work at a Mayflower Institute that says you can join if you're a Mayflower descendant, and then another ship comes that's called Mayflower, and they're like, my ancestors came to that. Not that one. But some of them never made it. John Robinson died in Holland in 1625. He never got to rejoin his church. But many did come across, and then eventually, they were able to dissolve the company from a company, and it became a town, which is really what the intent was all along. People got paid out, and then now they were the ones in charge, just like any other town people might come across. But you can see it's all just business. And it's just like nowadays, it doesn't always work out, It's like the dot-com bubble burst or something, everyone was like, oh yeah, this is the way to do it. We're gonna go do a fishing colony in America, and it's hard. And, if you're a tailor, you don't fish. So, their fishermen died or didn't get paid, all these things didn't happen. And to compound the problem, people in England who were investing on them, many of them were like, yeah, just do it. And it's like, they're not living here. You know, the first letter that was written from them when they sent the Mayflower back was to John Carter, who died in the first spring. So Brad would be like, one, I'm the governor now, he's dead, so that's on you. And two, this is why we didn't send you stuff, half of us died. So there was really a disconnect. But ultimately, it kind of worked out. So hopefully that's a little bit of a kind of a translation, if you will, about how, essentially, if you take anything away from this, it's that there are people, which I think is important for everything in history. As a history, you know, I have a history degree, I love history, and really the thing to remember is like, people back then just talked different, they dressed different, they thought different things, but at their core they're still people. They still loved, you know, feared, made mistakes, were selfish, were not selfish, you know, were very honorable, dishonorable, like, they're all just people. And they have good days and bad days, and so it's important to remember that because it's, you know, we're just people. So you strive for a good way of living, but you know, you can't hold everyone up on like a pedestal, I guess, or make them ultimate villains, because they're not. They're just people that wanted a better life for their family. So, that's my talk. The economics. Really about anything Pilgrim related. Also, yes, it was hot to wear those outfits. And you.
Can you say just a little bit more about the Mayflower Compact? Did I understand you to say that it replaced that contract? It didn't sound like, I don't think the Mayflower Compact sounds like an economic document.
It replaced the governance part of this, i.e. the idea that you are going to have to elect your own officials and you are going to follow the laws that they make, and you're going to do it for the common good, you know, laws, ordinances, and what have you, that the compact did. But legally, yeah, right, it doesn't say like, and then you're going to divide this. They had to get a new one of those, which said the exact same thing. This third time they got it. The second time it like was written in one guy's name, and they're like, wait a minute, that goes to the town, not you. And they, oh, and then sort of back. So really, it was more the idea that like, because the reason they wrote it, partly at least the way they wrote, the reason they said that they wrote it was that when they got here and realized that like this isn't, we're not going to live in Virginia. Some people were like, well, I'm going to do whatever I want, and they're like, that's not going to work because one, it's just wild, like. They don't like that, but also too, it's just, you're going to probably die. Like you need to work together. So they just put them all on, literally on the same page. Because the idea was if something happened, like kind of what it did, you know, I couldn't say like, I never agreed to that. That was a stupid idea. I'm not going to pay you back. But like, no, you signed right here. So it was all the men who were of a certain age, probably 21, we feel, because that was the majority, that were able to sign. So literally just on the same page. And then later they kind of got the official compact for the business end. And, you know, they never had like a royal governor because they didn't necessarily need it. And we still do the stuff that's in the compact because like I said, the compact was kind of, it's like how businesses were run already in England. It's just that you wouldn't like declare war on someone because that's what gentlemen are for. But here you can't wait like half a year to be like, yeah, we should probably send the troops out to like go revenge Squanto. So they were making decisions, but the concept was not new.
As a quick follow-up, as a historian, do you agree that the Mayflower Compact was like the very first time the consent of the governed was sort of enshrined? And we were taught as kids sometimes that was when true, like, the beginning of the democratic ideal. Is that
I think that it definitely was used as an example for later, like for America. They definitely looked to it as like, this is a great example, along with some others. And I think it was one of the earliest times in America, and just in like the Western world, for lack of a better term, where that was enacted and it kind of worked. But like the concept, I don't think like they invented it, because I mean, even just from their own sources, like I said, in that letter that they wrote, like that the Pastor Robinson wrote to them, he's telling them all the same stuff that like is in the compact, basically. And I think also especially because of their church, they were a covenanted church, and that was one of their big things. So one of their big disagreements was that the king shouldn't appoint like this, like you're not the, so they elected their own church officials too. So that was also part of it. So that existed for a while, like all the way back to Luther. So, well, not Luther, he thought that, that's a different talk. But basically yes and no. Essentially it was very important, but it wasn't the definite, like this is when it started, it was just one of many, that it just was a burgeoning idea.
Okay.
You're welcome. That's a good question.
So, there were investors.
Mm-hmm.
There were people who invested for themselves to go over and work. So
Yep.
they were both investors in themselves and who were. So it started out that way. Half the people died real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And then they try to ship goods back and forth, but that was probably stolen or disappeared. That 5 to 7 years later, everything gets basically it dissolved.
Mm-hmm. Well, sort of, yeah.
It's sort of. So the question is, did anybody ever make any money out of this deal?
Yes.
Or so who made the money out of the deal?
So essentially, like you were saying, so you can come across. So when they split the first time, because the other thing I didn't really touch on because it's time and it's very complicated, but there were people that they sent across that just like worked. They called them by their own particular. Either they were employees, so like, oh, we send sailors, they get paid to go home. They don't live here, they're not shareholders, they're not ever going to get paid out in stock. Some of them just came here to live. They caused all sorts of problems. There was a coup, wasn't effective, but that salt maker might have been one of them. Basically insider buyout. So when they sold off with that 1,800 pounds, they didn't really make money, but they kind of cut their losses. Some of those undertakers did make some money because fur was very profitable, and that's how they could pay. But really, what they got paid out in, which basically everyone did, was land. So everyone that was here that lived, even if you just got an acre, that's like unheard of back in England to really own it, because like, they owned it. It wasn't like, oh, I rent it. You know, they owned it as much as you could own it in the 17th century. You still had like the landlord and the king and all that, but like that was yours. You could pass it on to your kids. And some of these people are getting hundreds and hundreds of acres of land. That's part of the reason that the town splits up, because you can't fit all that in Plymouth. So right away they're like, well, I'm going to take my 400 acres and we're going off, you know, to like Marshfield. And then they're like, it's kind of a long walk to get to church. Can we just make our own? And that's like how the town split up, which actually made Bradford really sad, because he was really more in it for the covenant, like the church. But yeah, so those people did. Maybe a couple of people back in England that stuck on might have made some profit. But a lot of those people that really stuck on also probably pretty sympathetic to like the religious cause as well. Like this idea that these people, like at least in writing, they seem that way. They said like, even if you don't make any money, I'll still stick with you. And many of them did. I mean, there were a lot of people that sued. The English love litigation. This was like when it was first coming into favor, I guess. Like people, there's a guy that goes back and forth, Edward Doty, he sues this other guy over like one pig for 10 years. If you read like the old records, it's just like reading police briefs now. It's literally like, guy was found half naked leaning out a window, thrown away, and to arrest him. Like, it's all in there. So some people did, but some people died poor. Alden came to court and was, when he was near his end of his life, and he was like, I'm an old stander, I don't even have a coat. So he was all mad. So a lot of them didn't, but they all really got the land, which was the big thing.
At some point, the Plymouth colony gets absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay colony. What happens to the Plymouth colony at that point?
They just become like how we are like now, so just a town. And the reason it just sort of, Mass Bay, that was another, so again, we kind of stopped around the undertakers, but if you like were to like lightning around through it, it basically was, you know, okay, we're going to do fishing, it kind of works, kind of doesn't, and then when Mass Bay shows up, it's like they built a highway and you aren't on it. The whole, like no one's going to come to Plymouth when you can go to Boston Harbor. It's huge, it's deep. A lot of people actually, during the early years, like, we should move somewhere else. And they're like, no, we're staying here. Like, we already moved. They do eventually make like a kind of a nice profit for a little while selling stuff to Boston, like cattle and things like that, but even that kind of dries out. And there's little skirmishes, sort of, not like fighting, but like, you know, legal type things. And then eventually it just gets absorbed and it becomes a town. So it's still a town, but it's not like its own governing body. Like it was its own thing. You know, they were part of like the council of all the colonies when they were during like King Philip's War and the Pequot War. So like they were their own, like not country, but you know, like a state that we have now. But then they just kind of got absorbed in the 1690s, and it's also when the church started to die out and turn because it's just difficult. And kids, like any generation, go, oh, parents do. I want to be a Quaker, and then I said, no, get out of here. They was not like.
I was wondering, did the Pilgrims trade much with the Dutch from New Amsterdam?
Yes and no. They had the Dutch visit, and it's interesting that William Bradford puts it in 1628, even though other records put it in 27, which is conveniently when their contract is null and void. Because technically they're not, it's kind of a gray area. Remember I said they're kind of balancing? Because really they shouldn't be trading with the Dutch openly until they get the approval of the people that don't really want to have anything to do with them back in England. But once it dissolves, they do trade with the Dutch. There's a guy, Isaac de Vazier, who, his letters in this book. This is for visitors to early Plymouth. It's nice. It's talking about Plymouth, but not from the Pilgrim's point of view. So you get some interesting tidbits. But he comes, they, you know, give gifts of cheese and sugar and stuff, and they do have some trade. But a lot of the stuff that they really need, it's like, you know, they either can get it cheaper from England or, you know, so they keep friendly relations, but they're not like actively, and they're not really allowed to like sell stuff. That's like, again, it's all kind of controlled. Same with the Native Americans, they're not allowed in the town. It's a rule they pass, like you can't just free trade to like the Wampanoag. It's got to go through the town because they don't want people basically undercutting the price, which they complain about because other places don't follow the rules.
Could you maybe characterize this whole thing as the birth of capitalism in this country?
I think it's indicative of part of our country in the fact that, you know, we've always sort of had a strong go make ourselves, but it wasn't the idea of capitalism, but it is very like mercantile. But it wasn't just that. I mean, that's why Virginia was founded too. There was Pilgrim's colony up there. Like, so they all were like that. So Plymouth wasn't really the beginning because it wasn't the first, but this whole movement, yeah, it was kind of, you know, they've always had that idea in America. Like, yeah, we're going to make stuff for our family, but in doing so, work hard and, you know, do what you got to do.
Sandwich was the first town on Cape Cod. Was it funded by a splinter group from the Plymouth colony?
Yep. So Cape Cod was sort of technically under Plymouth's jurisdiction. So it was a big area. It wasn't just the town of Plymouth. It was like went up to basically right around like Weymouth area, and then it kind of in name at least. You know, it's not, again, it's, you can say you own somewhere, but no one lives there. It's just the woods. Good luck. But yeah, a lot of people went out to the Cape and sort of along the shore, and that's like how it spread first.
Situate would have been part of Plymouth too.
Yep, yeah, just in Barnstable, trying to remember but yeah, and then Cape Cod becomes like a Quaker place, so like a lot of them flew there, because it's the furthest away they can get. And so, like I said, they were all for freedom of their religion, not so much everyone else. So they had a big thing in Quakers.
I was taught when working at a Tuxedo, Eleanor Hammond did all the research, and she kept on drilling in us that Plymouth Plantation was the first colony of any nationality that meant to stay here forever because they brought their wives and children. Every other nationality, even the Spanish and the French, they came to take treasures back to the home country. But the Pilgrims were the first people that really wanted to settle here and stay.
That is definitely...
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say like as one of their motivations, because again, it's these families. So it is true. they didn't start shipping women to like Virginia till later, because all these single men jumping, this is a bad idea. So they did bring families eventually down there, or at least women to start families, because they realized like people work better if they're like with their families. But yeah, they're one of the first that really didn't just send men, for both good and bad. Because I mean, it's hard to take care of your family, and most of the women died in the first winter. There was 5 grown women that survived the first year. So we don't know why. It could be just because they were taking care of the children more. It could just be because they were on the ship longer. We really have no idea why, but it did seem to strike the women real hard. Kids survived more than you might think because they're full of energy and life and stuff. But yeah, so they definitely had that with them. Like that was a big thing, and that's possibly why it worked out really well in other regards too, like relations with the Wampanoag and things, because they said, oh, they got families. They're different. They're not the ones that just come by and steal us and then go away. So like, yeah, I think that is a difference. And that's also why, even though they're not the first people here, in my opinion at least, America really latched onto them as like the American immigration story, because, there were a bunch that were before them, even English. But, you can't really relate to like gentlemen and their servants coming across the dig for gold as much as you can like a family with some kids that just wants to have a house. So we really kind of, even though really they didn't do the first of anything, English-wise, in America, they really kind of, it's a relatable story in some ways. I mean, I've never been in the middle of nowhere on a boat, but you get the idea.
And one of the other statistics is that at the first Thanksgiving, there were 5 women to feed 97 men.
Yeah, and I mean, the children probably helped, but yeah, 9 grown women were the only ones that survived.
So I have 2 questions.
Okay. I hope I have 2 minutes.
I'm trying to find a way to relate it, but they're not. So,
that's okay.
First question is about the Psalter. And so I had read Bradford in different settings, once in school, once not.
Yep.
And I knew the story of the Psalter, and I thought that was interesting. He seemed like your classic con man, the way
that's what he seems to think, yeah.
And that all fit was a wonderful story. And then I actually studied and learned to make sea salt in the traditions of the day.
Yeah.
Not today, but 200 years ago, 300, 400 years ago. And went back and reread what Bradford wrote. And I don't think the man was a con man.
No, I don't know, because it's just biased.
What Bradford kept saying, he kept making these unreasonable demands. And they seemed to me to, and Bradford was some sort of pointing out that they didn't seem consistent to us, so we started to question this guy's integrity. But everything that he was saying was absolutely right. So from what I saw, he knew his stuff for salt making.
Yeah.
Whether he was a con man or not, it's a different issue.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a good point. And for everything is that all of our sources are for the most part biased, whichever source is. So we're reading Bradford's tale or other separatists. They're not going to say like, oh yeah, that guy was awesome, but then it gets him out. So I think I don't necessarily, we don't know if he like really tried to trick them or more just he just didn't make salt, and so they were like, So I agree with you in that. And then what was did you go?
Actually, take that one and then I'll.
So this is actually regarding the salt maker. I think you had said he was an employee.
Yes, he was hired.
He was hired by, so he didn't have any
shares. So
he
didn't have shares in the company. So he wasn't intending to live here per se.
Mm-hmm.
So there were many that were like that. There's also a potential rumor, well not rumor, but we don't know exactly who it was. They always just refer to him as the salt maker. But there is a potential connection to Roger Conant, who eventually goes up to Salem and House found it. So we don't know if it's the same person, but there are some connections that it could have been. And if that was the case, it's one of those weird things where Roger Conant, John Lyford, and John Oldham, there's these 3 guys that cause a big ruckus. They're all people that were hired, a minister, a captain, and a salt maker, and they all were offered jobs at that place up there by the Dorchester Company, who were also founded by people that left from the Plymouth Company. So, because you can invest in multiple companies. So there is this weird shady dealing going on behind the scenes that we don't have full knowledge of, because Bradford didn't have full knowledge of, and you kind of pick the pieces together. So it could have been that, but it could have just been like you were saying, he could have just not been able to make salt for whatever reason. It could have just been an accident, and tough luck for him. Yes?
Didn't Roger Williams split from Plymouth?
Yes.
And then there was a death threat against him, or a capital punishment for if he ever came back to Plymouth.
Yeah, Roger Williams was not very popular with a lot of the towns. So he actually came across as he was going to be a minister in Plymouth. He preached here. They had terrible luck on with the economy, but with getting a minister. Because again, they have to elect their own minister. And the first guy they brought across was John Lyford, who was kind of a very sketchy guy, at least according to the stories. But they also had a guy that they just said was crazed in the brain, whatever that means. And then Roger Williams. So he was good for a while, but he was too radical for them. And he basically bounced around New England until eventually he went down to Rhode Island. And so yeah, people were like, get out of here. Because he was just, again, these people, there was a step too far. And that was essentially, they're like, yeah, you shouldn't listen to a bishop. You gotta listen to the minister. But you can't talk about yourself. So like, the Quakers were like, no. And then like Anabaptists, they like hated Anabaptists because they baptized twice. It was the only real difference, not the only, but like that's the major difference between these two groups, and they're like literally stoning each other to death in Holland. Like it's the most minute thing. And part of it is that they were really afraid that you would think like, oh, it would be like the Native American religion or something that was like so radically different. But to them, it's kind of like, well, obviously that, whatever. But like these guys were real similar to ours, and they could really get our kids. So again, they're like worried that their kids are going to become like following Roger Williams, following, Quaker. And some of them do. It's really, you see some wills where like they cut out their oldest son and they give it to their oldest daughter. That never happens, and you look into it and you're like, oh, because he became a Quaker. Right. And the dad's like, you bother them at all, you're not getting anything. I'll fight you myself. Like, so they were really against that. To give a little defense to them, Quakers that we think of now, they were pacifists, but they were like, I'm going to get beat up pacifists and cause a ruckus. Like they would run through the street naked, they would like disrupt church service, they would, so like they were a little bit more extreme than maybe we think of, but still, it was, they're just trying to spread a message, and they were not down. So much so that Miles Standish actually was like, what are you guys doing? Like, this is what happened to you. And they're like, and I would probably have gone over, so.